Okay. All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Literary Modiin. I'm Julie Zuckerman, author of the Book of Jeremiah. And welcome to the July Literary Modiin author event. I'm going to say a few words of introduction. Many of you have been here before, so you've heard my spiel, but for those of you who are new, welcome. Modiin is a planned city in Israel about halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, right near the airport, so come visit. We have a large population of English speakers in Modiin. So in June 2019, I started Literary Modiin as a way to bring local Israel-based authors to the large community of English readers here. We had a few in-person events, and then when the pandemic hit, we switched to the virtual format, which allows us to hear from authors and welcome all of you from all over the world. So today is our 38th event. The format of each of today's event is that each author is going to speak for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions at the end after all three authors have. We have a large attendance, so everyone is on mute, but you can put your questions in the chat box as they're speaking, and then I'll get to all the questions at the end. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can send a private note in the chat to me. Right, we are also broadcasting this live on Facebook, as I said, so can feel free to share that if you're on Facebook as well. Okay, now I will introduce our first author. Daisy Alpert Florin attended Dartmouth College and received graduate degrees from Columbia University and Bank Street Graduate School of Education. She was a recipient of the 2016 Catherine Gerfine Writing Fellowship at Sarah Lawrence College and was a 2019-2020 fellow in the Bookends Novel Revision Fellowship. Her debut novel, My Last Innocent Year, was a New York Times editor's choice and a Washington Post staff pick. A native New Yorker, Daisy lives in Connecticut with her family. So now let me spotlight Daisy and ask her to unmute and take it away.
Well, hi, everyone. And thank you, Julie, so much for inviting me to be part of Literary Modiin, and to Maxim and Haviva for joining, us all being together at this event. So I'm Daisy Alpert Florin, and my debut novel is My Last Innocent Year, and it published in February of this year. The novel is set on a college campus in 1998. The college is called Wilder College, and it is based on my alma mater, Dartmouth College. So if you're familiar with Dartmouth, you can sort of imagine that as the setting. The main character is named Isabel Rosen, and Isabel is from the Lower East Side of Manhattan, what one reviewer called the pre-hipster Lower East Side. Her father is named Abe Rosen, and he owns an appetizing store on the Lower East Side, which I can describe that, explain that to you, although sometimes I don't need to with certain audiences, but an appetizing store sells smoked fish and cheeses, and as opposed to a deli, which serves meat. So that was the background that I imagined for my main character. And it's a very unusual background. I think it sort of highlights one aspect of the Jewish experience that my book captures. So the book, which I'll talk a little bit more about, the book is set during her final semester of college. And she's found ways to fit in despite feeling like an outsider on this campus, but she's found ways to fit in, and she's now getting ready to think about leaving when a couple of things happen to her. So the book opens with what I call a non-consensual sexual encounter that Isabel has with a friend whose name is Zev, and he is Israeli. And then after that happens, Isabel's friend Deborah, who is also happens to be Jewish, but also from Scarsdale, from a more traditional Jewish upbringing. Deborah convinces Isabel to perform an act of vigilante justice against Zev for what has happened, which Deborah feels very certain is rape, and Isabel feels less certain. So that's how the novel begins, and it kind of sets Isabel's final semester into some controversy and chaos. And then what happens after that is she ends up falling into a love affair with her married writing professor. So I kind of got into writing this novel because I had been writing for a while, mostly personal essays. And I found that a lot of the essays I was writing, looking back now, were mostly set during my college years. I hadn't really known that. I wasn't really aware of that, but I felt like there were a few reasons, I think. My college years were very alive to me. I feel like I've said, like, I think college is a time in your life where you feel like you're maybe living in a novel. It's like anything can happen. Your life could change. You know, you take one class and your life could change. You go to a party, you stand next to someone online in the dining hall, and anything, you know, your life could change. So that time felt so rich and thematically rich for me. And I also started to write these essays when I was in my late 30s and early 40s, and I was home raising 3 kids, which I loved and was a beautiful experience to me, but was also stifling in some ways. So I think I was trying to understand how the person I had been in college had kind of traveled this path to where I was today. So I started to write into those feelings and to write into that space. And after I finished writing this series of essays, I really wasn't finished with those ideas, with the ideas and the feelings that had come up at that time. I wanted to go back to that setting. I wanted to go back to that time, the 90s, when I was coming of age. And I wanted to say something about being Jewish and how that felt to me, especially in a setting at a place like Dartmouth in the 90s. And I also wanted to say something about sexual politics and how it felt to come up as a woman, especially a creative person, when so many of the gatekeepers, the people who kind of held the keys to these gates that we wanted so badly to open, were men. How it felt to come up essentially in patriarchy. So, you know, the other thing, and I wasn't really aware that I was doing this, but I was writing a Jewish novel based a lot on what my own experience with Judaism has been. And I'll talk a little bit more about that now because of the audience that I have. I don't always talk about this because it's not always interesting to general readers, but you might find it interesting. I grew up in New York. My father is Jewish, was raised in Brooklyn, an immigrant family, but he wasn't very religious. The family was not very religious. So he married my mother, who was from Sweden, was not Jewish. And we kind of lived this New York life that was like grounded in Jewish culture in a lot of ways, but not religious at all. But one of the ways that Jewish culture came alive to me was on these trips we would take to the Lower East Side to go to these kinds of stores like Russ and Daughters, Ratner's, Kosar's Bialys, Gus's Pickles, Yonah Schimmel Knishes. Like that was kind of my experience with Judaism and Jewish culture. And I felt very connected to that. But then it was only throughout my life as I came, in contact with people who had different experiences with Judaism that I felt kind of on the outside of that. I was like, oh, I'm not really that, but then I don't really feel part of, mainstream like WASP culture, for lack of a better term. So I was I made Isabel have this kind of background as a way to explore those contradictions. Hold on, I'm just looking at my timer so that I can be very good on my time. So that's something that I think is interesting about the novel and makes the novel unique, because I had never really read a book where I felt like my Jewish experience was captured. So that was important to me. Another big theme of the book is the idea of consent and what consent means. And I think that's a word that feels more familiar to us now. It was a word that I was aware of in the 90s, but I don't think it was as much a part of our vernacular as it is now. I didn't really set out to write a book about consent, but that is just a theme that has come up as I talk to readers, because the book starts with this sexual encounter that Isabel feels conflicted about. It's not really something that she feels good about, but she's not really sure that it, sort of holds this label of rape, but her friend Deborah feels that very strongly. So that's kind of an early conflict in the book. And then as she goes on to have this consensual affair with her writing professor, I was interested in thinking about, like, well, can a relationship that is based on an unequal power dynamic, can there be consent there? I don't have an answer to that. I don't answer that question. I think the book really stays in this gray areas around that, which is where I'm comfortable to stay when I talk about these big and complicated issues. Certainly the backdrop is, I set the book specifically in 1998, which is against the loose backdrop of the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, although it really only touches on that throughout the novel, because I do think as college students, it maybe wasn't something that college students at that time were thinking about all the time, but I did really want to, it actually became like a perfect backdrop for the book, because when Isabel is having what she believes is a consensual sexual relationship with her professor, just as Monica Lewinsky had, which she has always said was a consensual relationship with the president, I really want to like dig into how much we can consent to relationships that are at their heart unequal. I started writing the book a long time ago, back in 2015, before the Me Too movement had really, even sort of emerged on, in our common vernacular, and before the Trump years. So I really do feel like I was already thinking about, how we can connect our younger selves to our older selves, and how we can re-examine the times that came before us. So that's just a lot of stuff about the book. I'm going to read a short section at the very beginning of the book. So Isabel, this is going back to when Isabel meets her friend Zev for the first time. So it's a flashback to when they first meet. So thank you for listening. Zev and I met on the first Friday of freshman year at a Shabbat dinner at Hillel House, the small beige building on the edge of campus where Wilder's skeletal collection of Jews gathered. Like many elite colleges, Wilder had a long history of institutional anti-Semitism, as well as a more recent scandal involving fraternity brothers forcing a group of barefoot pledges in striped pajamas to carry heavy stones across the green. The Holocaust imagery was undeniable, and the incident attracted national attention. But things had settled down, and a few years back, a group of Jewish alumni raised the money to establish a Hillel house on campus, so Jewish parents were finally comfortable sending their children to Wilder. My father had had no such qualms. I'd spent my whole life around Jews, and he wanted me to go to Wilder precisely so I could get away from them. I went to the dinner with Sally Steinberg of the Bethesda Steinbergs, whom I'd met earlier that week in a step aerobics class. Sally was the coddled only child of older parents who'd met at Brandeis, where they desperately wanted her to go, but Sally had insisted on Wilder. Her parents relented, as they did with everything, and as a prerequisite to enrollment, they'd made her promise to attend weekly Shabbat dinners. Zev was there when we arrived, sitting at the long dining table. The They shook hands, something I'd only ever done with adults, and rarely at that. Pleased to meet you, he said, taking Sally's hand and then mine. His grip was strong, his fingers stained yellow at the tips. Let me guess where you're from, he said, as girls in long skirts fluttered around us, carrying handfuls of plastic silverware and jugs of grape juice. New York. How'd you know? He pointed at my scuffed Doc Martens. But you're not an uptown girl, not West Side either. Downtown? Impressive, Lower East Side. He asked what my father did for a living, something else people at Wilder did, and I told him he owned an appetizing store. An appetizing store? Really? Wow, I didn't know Jews like you still existed. Jews like what? Jews who sell smoked fish and seeded rye. I thought all those stores were gone. A lot of them are gone, but there are still a few. I named them. Gus's Pickles, Yona Schimmel Knishes, Kosar's Bialys, Russ and Daughters. Cute, Zev said, like something out of a Malamud novel. He reached for a piece of challah. So what, your father pinned all his hopes on you? Sent you here to fulfill his dreams of upward mobility? I didn't know what to say. I'd never heard my father's ambitions summed up so succinctly or so crassly. Zev was looking at me like I was a unicorn, but I couldn't tell if it was wonder in his eyes or if he wanted to lure me closer to cut off my horn. Before I could answer, the rabbi began reciting the prayers welcoming in Shabbat. Dinner was chaotic and long. There were many courses, each one interrupted by more prayers and candlelighting. The long-skirted girls, one of whom was the rabbi's wife, cleared plates and poured seltzer, while the rabbi's two young sons ran around dressed like miniature actuaries. I hadn't been around so many Jews since I got to Wilder, not that there were a lot of us. The room felt crowded, mostly on account of it being small. Sprung loose from Scarsdale and Great Neck, the Jews of Wilder had to stick together. During dinner, I found out Zev was a freshman like me, but older because he'd spent those 2 years in the army. He was short and stocky, with close-cropped black hair and a nose that looked like it had been punched in. He smelled like cigarettes and body spray. We bonded mainly over our mutual disdain of everyone else, including Sally, who announced loudly that she'd come to the dinner because her mother told her it would be a good place to find a husband. She would go home that night with the boys seated to her left, Gabe Feldman, whom she would indeed eventually marry. Over the years, I would discover that Zev's disdain for people extended to most everyone at Wilder, perhaps even to people in general. But that night, making fun of the people at Hillel House was the most fun I'd had since I arrived. So that's just a little taste of the book, and I'll just stop there and thank you so much and look forward to hearing from the other participants.
Thank you so much, Daisy. That was great. I'm gonna introduce our next speaker. Wait, I'm gonna ask you to unmute for a second. Okay, our next speaker is Maxim Shrayer, bilingual author, scholar, and translator, a professor at Boston College. He is a Guggenheim Fellow and winner of the National Jewish Book Award. Shrayer's many books include Waiting for America, A Russian Immigrant, and Of Politics and Pandemics. Shrayer's works have been translated into 11 languages. So, Maxim, I'm going to spotlight you and then take it away.
Thank you so much, Julie, for hosting this event and for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm also really delighted to share this Zoom podium with Daisy and Haviva. I also want to say that it's very nice to see some friends in the audience, including Enid Wertman. I don't know if you know, she's a legendary person in the Soviet Jewry movement. And I say this as a former refusenik with a lot of gratitude and appreciation. So I'm going to talk very briefly about this little book called Immigrant Baggage, which was published back in April, and it is a memoir. I'll talk first about how this book came into existence. And by the way, I'm speaking to you from the village of South Chatham on Cape Cod, which is where the bulk of this book was written. So basically, I wrote it very much in the setting from which I'm now reporting. And what I should tell you is that I composed the bulk of this book during the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, much of the book has to do with travel, with crossing boundaries of cultures, with examining lived experiences, both as a stranger looking in and as a resident peering out. As you remember, particularly during the first COVID spring, when life came to a standstill and when movement across borders of countries became impossible, I began to reflect on some of the most memorable travel adventures, and I suppose misadventures as well, of the previous 5 years. And so the book really initially came out of the prohibition against the freedom of movement. That was the initial impulse behind the memoir. And when I started writing it, I envisioned it primarily as tragicomic. And I think it's still that to some degree, but I think one could challenge me on this point. What I discovered when I was writing the book and when I was intensively reflecting on some travel experiences, and of course for me, who was born in Moscow, who emigrated to this country at the age of 20, who has lived in America for almost 40 years, border crossings have a special significance. And so what I discovered is that attempts at border crossing sometimes delight or enchant the transgressor. And of course, we all have this expectation that travel is wonderful and ponderous, but I also think it augurs disappointment, heartbreak, and even real danger. In fact, one of the chapters in this book has to do with the last time I traveled to Russia in the summer of 2019 with my younger daughter, Tatiana, who is almost 16, so she was younger at the time. And this was a near disaster, which basically unraveled, took me back to my years at Moscow University, and then to a provincial town in the south of Russia, where basically we faced real danger that was politically motivated, with a Jewish angle as well. So basically, that's the first piece. I think, and since Julie mentioned some of my other books, I should talk a little bit about how this memoir relates to the other memoirs I've written. And I have written kind of 3.5, I suppose. So I have a dilogy, Waiting for America, a story of immigration, and Leaving Russia, a Jewish story. I wrote Waiting for America first, but chronologically it takes place second. Leaving Russia is a story of growing up Jewish and in the Soviet Union and of the refusenik experience. Waiting for America is a story of discovering the West after we came first to Vienna and then spent the summer of 1987 in Italy. And then also I wrote a little book which came out of a journalistic assignment called With or Without You, the prospect for Jews in today's Russia. So back when I wrote it in 2016, Russia still had about 160,000 Jews. Of course, as you know, the invasion and the war in Ukraine have depleted the community. So the book is partly a memoir, partly a kind of journalistic investigation. But basically, all those other books, even though they are personal stories, they are also stories of time and epoch. And as such, in them, I had to contend, and I think it's almost inevitable when you write that kind of memoir, I had to contend with larger narratives of history. This is something I tried very hard to avoid, and I hope I succeeded, although it's for you to judge, to avoid basically a memoir that is also writing a larger story, a larger historical narrative. This is very much a book that is a book of fragments, a story in fragments. It is really, in addition to adventures and misadventures of travel and of border crossing, it's a story of living within and without languages. In my case, primarily Russian and English, which are my two primary literary languages. It's also, I guess, a story of a translingual self that refuses to be trapped in museums of culture and identity. And I will talk about that in a little while. And in that sense, a immigrant who sort of refuses to just be stereotyped as an immigrant and seeks a greater freedom of expression outside this predictable mold, this predictable archetype. Now, I guess, and this is a particularly difficult day to be speaking about the war in Ukraine, because as you know, today Odessa was heavily hit, and really it is looking more and more like herbicide, like Russia's attempt to murder a city, not just kill its population, not just destroy Ukraine as a country, but deliberately kill this vibrant city, which of course has a very important Jewish history. For me, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has placed, and this, by the way, is for the second time since my family's immigration, placed this kind of demarcation line between my past and my present. And so in the spring of 2022, as I was putting the finishing touches to this book, I kept thinking of the bloodshed in Ukraine, not only as an attempt by Putin's regime to murder the land where 3 of my 4 grandparents were born and grew up, and a land that I feel a kinship, a real connection through the roots, through my family's past, but also as a neo-colonial war, which is aimed at restoring the Soviet past. So in a certain sense, immigrant baggage is also a story of separation from Russia's present and future, while remaining culturally, and I guess linguistically, Russian. And let me finally talk about the question of what I call translingual pleasures and perils. So I'm often asked the inevitable question. I was just asked it yesterday at a book signing I did here in Chatham at a local bookstore. What language do you think in? This happens almost every time. And I think it's a totally valid question. And so I'm asked, what language do you think in? Russian, English, both. And I reply honestly that it hardly matters for the creative output, for the creative outcome. What do I mean by that? Over the years, for instance, I've had vivid dreams in which I lectured in French at the Sorbonne, and I've had this dream several times, about very sophisticated matters of cultural theory. In reality, my spoken French is quite limited. Let's put it this way. I couldn't do this in French without having to read from my notes. Also, there was a period in my life when I was researching what eventually became a lot of my work having to do with the inner culture of Russian emigres, with Vladimir Nabokov, with Ivan Bunin, the first Russian writer to have received the Nobel Prize in 1933. And so when I was living in Prague, I had these dreams where I would have these symposia with 1968 Czech dissidents, and we would argue politics. In reality, my Czech is quite rudimentary. So why is this happen? I think it points to the fact that dreams give us access to deeper realms of cultural production, mechanisms that probably impact translingual writers, because I think what they do is they reveal the hidden realms of exile. And what those hidden realms of exile are, I think, is part of what you discover as you read this book. I guess I will conclude by reading, if I still have time, Julie, a short passage which comes, thank you, from the middle of the book. So the book has 6 chapters, and this one is called In the Net of Composer N. So there is a emigre Russian composer whose last name is basically concealed with just the first initial N, but it's fairly easy to figure out who I am referring to. And it's a fairly long and circuitous story, which begins when I'm still a teenager in Moscow, and which brings one to Russia on the brink of the invasion of Ukraine, when it became really apparent that this is hopelessly a totalitarian society. Kind of as I kept going back to Russia, so we left in 1987. I didn't go back for the first 6 years because we were stateless. And then when we became US citizens, eventually we also became Israeli citizens, but that's a different story. I'm a dual citizen. But basically, when I had at least the safety of one passport, I started going back. And I went back quite regularly to lecture, to do research, also to attend to the family graves. And basically, the last time I was there, which was 2019, it was absolutely clear to me that it was probably the last time until the regime changes. So the story starts far back in the depth of the last Soviet decades, and it brings you to the present. And I'll just read a couple of opening pages. In the net of composer N. The winter of 1978 was the last time I tasted of the forbidden fruit that Soviet golden youth consumed with habitual indifference. We were spending the winter holiday at Maleevka, the writer's home of creativity outside Moscow. My parents had entered the path of emigration. My mom had already said goodbye to her beloved job as a professor of business English and interpreter. My father, too, had to bid adieu to the Research Institute of Microbiology, where he had worked since the mid-1960s. My parents had placed their Soviet careers, quite successful for Jews who weren't party members, on the execution block, except that instead of permission to leave, refusnikdom awaited us. For my father, that winter vacation at Maleevka was also a farewell to his life as a Soviet writer. His official punishment just for the attempt at exodus would be not only banishment from academic life, but also expulsion from the Union of Soviet Writers, the derailment of 3 books, and public ostracism. But back then, as a 12-year-old, I couldn't imagine that my parents ever made mistakes. Nor could I imagine that a year later, the Soviet troops would invade Afghanistan as the rule of corpses propelled the USSR into its own unraveling. How could we possibly foresee that I would celebrate my bar mitzvah not in the Holy Land, but in a Moscow shrouded with summertime poplar snow? In a certain causal sense, the events I described below had not much to do with the political and personal backdrop of my teenage years, and yet, without this backdrop, I couldn't have become the witness and observer typing these lines on a chilly afternoon on May 9th, the day of victory over Nazi Germany. The daily routine at the writer's home of creativity, situated at the former estate of the publisher Vukol Lavrov, looked like this. An abundant breakfast, heavy on pastries and farmer's cheese, creative time, strolls around the nearby wintry forests and fields, lunch with alcohol, rest, some more creative time, finally, billiards and supper with abundant drinking that sometimes continued into the late hours. Writers' spouses and writers' science spent their entire days in various social amusements. 2 groups could be distinguished among the young generation. Boys and girls my age, still innocent, but already beginning to don the air of sophistication, and the true golden youth, university students who acted as though the privileges they enjoyed were hereditary, endless, and limitless. Most outrageously behaved was the son of the poet Rima Kazakova, this young man who would subsequently become known for his psychedelic fiction, wandered the halls of the old manor house and tried to glue himself to every writer's teenage daughter or granddaughter. Due to a strange concurrence of circumstances, the core of the group of kids that I was running with that winter holiday was composed not of the children, but rather of the grandchildren of Soviet writers. Our intellectual leader was a boy by the name of Sasha Taratuta, whose Paris-born elderly grandmother, critic and memoirist, was best known for her work on Ethel Lillian Voynich, author of The Gadfly, a late Victorian novel about a radicalized English Catholic in Risorgimento era Italy. Voynich's book enjoyed cult status in Soviet Russia and the People's Republic of China. On the day we met, Sasha took me aside and asked, his bright voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper, "Have you heard of composer N?" "No, I haven't," I answered sincerely. "What's wrong with you? My grandmother told me all about him. An aristocrat, immigrated, went to Cambridge University, lived in America, died in Switzerland. A genius." Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. That was great. Okay. I would like to introduce our last author for today, who's actually, this is her third appearance in Literary Modiin. Haviva Ner-David is a writer. I'm reading this wrong. Haviva Ner-David is a rabbi and a writer. She has a thriving spiritual companioning practice and runs the only mikveh in Israel open to all to immerse as they please. Haviva is the author of 3 memoirs, 2 novels, and a children's book, and she is the parent of 7 children, 6 biological and 1 adopted. Haviva is also an activist building a shared society of partnership among Palestinians and Jews in the Galilee where she lives. Haviva was born with a genetic muscular disease called FSHD, and that has been one of her life's biggest, biggest life challenges and teachers. So Haviva, I'll ask you to unmute, and I'm going to spotlight you.
Okay.
Hi.
Hello. Okay, so now, so I'm the last one, so I see overlap in my books and in my book with both of your books. And one thing that you said, Daisy, about consent, so that's also a theme in my book, which is To Die in Secret. And also the theme of being Jewish, but not being especially religious. Also Naomi, the main character in this book. And COVID, I wrote the book during COVID and after COVID, and it was inspired by COVID to write it, which I'll speak about in a second. And I'll just say that, I'll just show you my different books. So I wrote three memoirs, and this is the most recent one, is Dreaming Against the Current. And my first novel, my debut novel, is Hope Valley. And my children's book is Yona and the Mikveh Fish. Okay. So this book is To Die in Secret, and it just came out at the beginning of the month. And as I said, it takes place during COVID, and I knew that was challenging. And I had read some articles too saying that people shouldn't write about COVID right away and should wait. And I just felt though that I wanted it to take place during COVID. And it also has universal themes, but there's definitely, COVID is definitely the backdrop of the book. And it was also challenging thinking about always having to keep in mind the masks and people wearing masks and when would they be wearing masks, and then how do you show the expression on their face? So that was an interesting challenge in writing the book. So some things that happened during COVID that inspired me to write the book, and then I'll tell you about what it's about. One was the death of a woman that I knew. She was an acquaintance. She wasn't a really good friend, but she died very tragically during COVID. And there were a lot of questions around her death. And because I also didn't know her that well, after she died, I started to learn more about her and got really interested in her. And there was a lot of synchronicity around her death too. She was a Buddhist, and I was very interested in this idea of getting to know somebody, after they die, and also thinking about how they died. And I thought the book is from the point of view of Naomi, who's the main character, and it's all from her point of view. My first novel, was all from the point of view of one of the protagonists, whose name is Tikva. And about halfway through, that book took me like 7 years to write, and this book only took me a year. And I decided about halfway through with the first novel that I was going to add in the point of view of the other main protagonist, Rabia. And in this book, so I also thought at some point, well, maybe I should put in the point of view of Jude, who is the sister of the main character, Nomi, and she's the one who died. And then I realized that no, I wanted, there was this whole theme of like getting to know someone after they die. And so if the readers also would have Jude's point of view, then that would ruin that feeling. And I wanted them to be like on the same level as Nomi in the book, of not knowing Jude that well. And I'll explain why she didn't know her that well. Another thing that happened during COVID was, and a little before COVID too, one of my sons was dealing with mental illness at the time. And that was very much on my mind, obviously. And this whole theme of parenting under difficult circumstances and challenging circumstances is a big theme in the book as well. And the book is dedicated to the good enough parents of the world. And that was this question of like, what does it mean to be a good parent? Is it enough to be a good enough parent? And especially the helplessness around having a child who was struggling with mental illness. So that's also a theme in the book. And something else that happened during COVID that inspired the book was, first of all, like I said, I have this muscular disease, and right before COVID, my lungs started to be affected by it as well. And so then that put me in this high risk category. And then also at the height of the pandemic, my husband was diagnosed with a life-threatening autoimmune disease, and he spent a month in the hospital, in Rambam Hospital. And so I definitely during that time imagined my own death in a COVID ward all by myself, all alone, and my husband's death, and then dealing with how would that be for me if he's gone. And so that's also a theme in the book, very much, is loss and grief. And also the meaning of life, it asks these big questions, and what gives life meaning, especially in the face of loss and grief. And also this theme of connecting with people when they're no longer alive. And is there a way we can connect with them? Can they connect with us? Can we communicate with them? So I'll tell you that the book is about, this woman, Nomi, who grew up in the United States, and because of a traumatic event when she was in her final year of high school, she leaves the US. She grew up in Massachusetts, which I didn't. I grew up in New York, and that was fun, imagining growing up in Massachusetts. And she grew up in the suburbs of Boston. And when we meet her, so she because of this traumatic event, she left home. She ran away pretty much to Israel, and she ended up marrying a kibbutznik. She was volunteering on a kibbutz, and she met someone, Avi, and married him. They were married for 40 years, and he died of COVID about 9 months before the book opens. And the book, also, they had no children. She had uterine cancer, and they didn't have any children, and they didn't adopt either. And when the book opens, Nomi's on an airplane going back to the United States for the first time in 42 years. She just heard that her sister Jude was found dead in her farmhouse on the outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts, with her only son, Jonah. And Jude was Nomi's only sibling, and her father had already passed, and her mother is living in a nursing home with dementia. And so Nomi's on the way back to settle her sister's estate and to see what to do with her mother. And she has nothing, she owns nothing. She's been living on a kibbutz where it's a collective. She owns nothing. Her husband's gone. She has no children. And so she's very much in this kind of lost place in her life. Where am I with time? I didn't see when I started. Okay. See, there are many the book has a lot of layers to it, and I've been told that if from people who've read it since it came out, and I like that description, so I'm going to say that. And someone else who put a review on Amazon said it was a multifaceted gem, so I like that as well. It's a little hard to talk about unless you've read the book because of all these layers, but I'll also say that so the book takes place, Nomi arrives at this farmhouse that was her sister's farmhouse, and the farmhouse also is very much kind of a character in the book and has a history as well. Wait, Julie, how much, sorry, how am I with time? I should have looked.
I have like 6.5 minutes left. Yeah.
Okay, so I will read. Oh, I'll also say though that it's the book also is a spiritual book. All my books have some spiritual elements to them. And so there's a Chabad rabbi in the book, there's Reform Jews in the book, there's a Jewish priestess in the making, there's Buddhists, there's witches. It takes place in the outskirts of Salem. And it was really fascinating doing the research about Salem and the witch trials and colonial times. And I discovered this woman, Dorothy Talbia, I hope I'm saying her name correctly, who murdered one of her children, who killed one of her children, and she was hanged, and she was mentally ill. That's, as I said, that's a theme in the book, and I ended up creating a fictional character, Leah Marshall, I called her, who's very much based on Dorothy Talbia also, but I changed things. So I'm going to read right from the beginning, from the first chapter, and maybe even a little bit after that. Okay. Chapter, okay. Not taking up much room in the world, perhaps no room at all, ephemeral and barely existing. That's how Nomi felt. She looked out the airplane window at the clouds, floating like she was, suspended between here and there. It had not been difficult to tie things up. She didn't own her house. Everything belonged to the kibbutz collective. She was lucky they let her leave with her jeans and tank top, thick hooded sweatshirt, and small carry-on suitcase with what she took from the contents of her and Avi's closet. The travel committee had bought her a one-way ticket to Logan Airport, given her $2,000 in spending money, and wished her well. They had called an emergency meeting the week before, as soon as Nomi heard about her sister and nephew's sudden deaths. The head of the housing committee called to tell her their decision. She should be in touch when she was ready to return, he said. They would hold her house and membership for 6 months only, which would be enough time to be there for the ongoing investigation, sort through the deceased's belongings, and decide what to do with Nomi's elderly mother, who was now totally alone. We'll buy you a ticket back when you're ready. In the meantime, foreign workers will sleep in the house, he added. Not, do you mind if foreign workers sleep in your marriage bed of the past 40 years, just months after your beloved Avi has died? That was how things were done on the kibbutz, which also had its benefits. Sometimes she preferred being told what to do, since she did not always know what she wanted. But kibbutz committees cared little for an individual's needs. The kibbutz was all about the common good, leaving little room for her personal trauma. This made it easier for her to lock the door to her 2-room cottage and hand over the key, even after having lived there all her adult life. Her repeated fate, leaving with practically nothing, not even much of a plan. The summer after her senior year of high school, she had been running from the only place she knew, her childhood home in the Boston suburbs, on an airplane going in the opposite direction she was headed now. She had not liked that daunting, even terrifying feeling then, and now going back, she was too numb to think or feel. Her parents had been barely speaking to her then. She, in her shame, had hidden behind her baggy clothing and shaggy hair. She could hardly eat and had lost almost 20 pounds before the school year ended. Your sister, maybe, but not you. What a waste. You were the smart one, the one with promise, her father had said. And Nomi understood her prospects for a worthwhile life in their eyes were gone. Her mother stood there, shaking her head as if there were no words that could convey the abomination of Nomi's sin. Her older sister, Judith, or Jude, as she asked to be called, because of the Beatles song, not the Apostle, had gone off to live on a commune instead of college and had never been much of a student anyway. Both girls had biblical names, but their parents had given Jude a Yiddish name as her Jewish one, named after her great-grandmother, Yehudis Gittel, meaning good Jew, which turned out to be ironic. By the time Nomi was born, 5 years later, the fashion was to give Hebrew Jewish names, so Nomi got Naomi, meaning pleasant, which was her English name as well, and should have been easy enough to emulate. But neither daughter managed to live up to their names in their parents' eyes. Nomi too changed her name, but only after leaving home, and never even told her parents or sister of the slight alteration. Whereas Jude had been bold enough to change hers while still living under her parents' roof. Jude had always been bolder and braver than Nomi, and smarter too, despite what her parents thought. But she was not interested in schools and their rules. Jude was a source of vexation to her parents, whereas Nomi was the reliable one, or at least she had been before her life turned upside down. She was more studious than smart. She had known how to give her teachers what they wanted because their expectations were clear and she had the skills to meet them. She found boundaries, law, and order comforting. Nomi remembered the day Jude had revealed her plan to leave home for the commune, established by a group attempting to build a collective on the grounds of a failed 19th century transcendentalist, self-sustaining Emersonian farm community. It was not far from the summer sleepover camp on the outskirts of Salem Nomi and Jude had both attended when they were younger. The original community had not lasted even a year because of a scandal, or was it a murder, or both? The cabins had been deserted and any later attempts to live on the land had been unsuccessful. Legend had it there was a curse on the property, or maybe a witch's spell, considering its proximity to Salem, dating back to its original owners in colonial times. This was all Jude knew. Taking advantage of this superstitious nonsense, a group of post-beatnik hippies had started squatting there and working the land. They were building a commune, and Jude was going to join them, she said, swearing Nomi to secrecy. She didn't mind rules if they were not authoritarian. Nomi listened, wide-eyed, in awe of her sister's nerve and sophistication. They were sunning themselves by the pool when Jude confided in Nomi, a rare occasion since Jude normally made no attempt to hide her resentment of her sister's favored status. Nomi felt privileged to be let into her older sister's world, mysterious and out of reach to Nomi, and frightening too, dangerous even. It was not a world Nomi would have wanted to visit. She did not envy her sister's life on the edge. She was too fearful to venture there, but it harder for long to stand in Jude's shoes for long enough to experience the thrill, with no trepidation, only abandon like her sister. It had always been that way. At the Jewish Country Club, Jude was the one who dove from the highest diving board, while Nomi had to muster all her courage just for the low one. Jews were not welcome at the other country club, her parents explained, and besides, it was best to socialize with your own. In other words, the young men the sisters would meet at the Jewish one. Her parents were not especially religious, attending synagogue only during the high holidays and for life cycle ceremonies, and sending Jude and Nomi to Hebrew school on Sunday mornings instead of full-time Jewish day school. But their Jewish identities were strong, their social circle all Jews, and it was understood their daughters marrying out of the faith would be unacceptable, disloyal, crossing a sacred cultural barrier. Besides, Jewish men made better husbands. They did not necessarily make better boyfriends, Nomi discovered.
Thank you, Haviva. That was great. I'm going to add back the spotlights of all of the authors and ask you guys to unmute. You can all put your questions in the chat box. I see we have a number of questions already. A lot around fictional choices. Here, Haviva, you can unmute also. Okay, thank you all. That was, I also saw a lot of overlap in some of the themes and topics. And as Maxim was talking about all his dreams, I was thinking of your other book, Haviva, and that you can ask her to interpret your dreams. She's Are you like a licensed dream?
That's a dream work. Yeah, I didn't
Yeah,
put that.
okay.
That's one of my spiritual companioning tools. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of questions for Daisy. She went first, and I know you answered a bit of them in the chat, but maybe you can touch on them a bit. We can start with Abigail's question about she was intrigued whether you or your character felt outside in some Jewish groups, as her mother is not Jewish. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, Isabel's mother actually is Jewish, but she's dead. So that's just another mother piece for Isabel. But my mother wasn't Jewish. And the question was, did I ever feel outside Jewish groups because of that? And the answer is yes. Only later in my life, though. It was not something I was really aware of growing up or even into my 20s. And I actually married, my husband is Jewish, and I actually converted to Judaism officially in a reform ceremony right before I got married. And it really wasn't like a very big deal. At the time, I didn't feel like it was a very big deal. But then raising my kids, my 3 kids in different Jewish communities, there were times where I felt that that my identity as a Jew was being questioned, even though I had converted. There were questions around my conversion. There were questions around the brisses of my sons and who had performed them. And I was really trying to just kind of do the right thing and give my kids something that I hadn't had, because I had grown up without a religious identity. And I thought, well, let's try it this way. So, and I feel very committed to it. I'm very happy with that choice. So then when I was questioned, just quite frankly, I felt like I had to sort of turn away from my mother in this way. And my mother is also died more than 20 years ago. So I felt like I had already lost her I had lost her. And so then being asked to it felt like asking me to turn away from her even more. And I grappled with that for several years before I finally just sort of decided that, I wasn't going to do that, and that I was just going to be confident in my own identity, such as it is. So thank you for asking that question, because it's something I have definitely felt in my life. Not so much anymore, but during those like fragile years where I was trying to figure out my identity, what I was giving my kids, how to incorporate this new thing for me, because bringing religion into my life was sort of new for me. So it was hard. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna go to, there's like kind of 2 questions from Maxim, which is, why did you choose the US over Israel? Other than maybe you were a kid, so maybe your parents chose it. And what language do you think? And she wasn't sure you answered the question. Maybe it's both.
Okay. Well, I was 20, but
Oh, okay, right.
I sense a tone of disapproval, which usually people who ask this question implies that they disapprove. I, with all due respect, am not prepared to justify the choice that my family made after almost a decade as refuseniks. I am a dual citizen of the US and Israel by choice, and I spent a lot of time in Israel. But let's leave it at that. Now, the second question, I've heard this question plenty, especially in the earlier years after we left the former Soviet Union. Now, the question about what languages I think in is an interesting one. I guess the point I was making is that I no longer see a connection between that and how my writing turns out. On a everyday practical level, think in both Russian and English, although I also think in languages that I'm also to some degree proficient in when I'm in those countries. However, that's honestly not what I was trying to get across. What I was trying to suggest that the texture of writing, whether it is in English or in Russian, my two principal languages. I have contributed to the translations of my work into other languages. I try to do that to the best of my ability. It's a very perilous thing. It's almost better not to. So, for instance, when I had a book translated into Chinese, I couldn't find my name on the cover. I had to ask my daughters, who have been studying Mandarin since kindergarten. So basically, I had no input. But when, say, I read the Italian translations of my books, I recently struggled through a Portuguese translation of a book. But in those cases, I don't contribute to the literary texture. I just kind of read it for accuracy. With Russian and English, however, it is, for me, at this point, a kind of open-ended experiment where I used to think that there is a connection between, say, a certain topic in which I am better positioned to write in Russian because I've, say, spent a lot of time dealing with it. I've thought this topic through in Russian versus a different one in English. Let's say I went to college here, and if I write about college, I think it comes more naturally for me to write about my years at Brown in English. But now, honestly, it's no longer the case. And what's been happening of late, if I could just take 1 minute to explain, is I call it parallel writing, where basically what I've been doing is I would write a piece, and it's both prose and poetry, say in English, and then a few days later, I would write a piece that runs parallel to it in Russian, or vice versa. And it's not an auto-translation. In other words, for instance, I'll give you an example. I wrote a poem which was published some time ago about the bombing of Odessa, which kind of anticipated what happened today. So now I, this morning, started doing a parallel Russian version, but it's a different text. It only shares the thematic thrust with the original. And when it is done, it will feel like kind of I'm living in two parallel linguistic universes. Sometimes they are like in Lobachevsky's math, and sometimes they are in regular Euclidean geometry. I guess that's what is happening. Thanks for that question. I really appreciate it.
Great. So there was a question to Daisy, but I also want to expand it to Haviva about fictional choices. The question for Daisy was there a particular reason the rapist character, rapist in quotes, because even Isabel is not sure what it is, why that character is Israeli? And my fictional choice question for you, Haviva, is why did you choose to have Nomi not go back for 40 years? It's like a long time. And even with lots of families with dysfunction and estrangement, like most people I know still do go back at some point and, see their family. So why did you make that choice? So you can both answer.
I'll answer first. I think, I do think it's important to point out that I never, he's never really like the term like rapist, I think is, the book deals with the nuance and the gray areas around sexual assault and sexual consent. So when Isabel's friend Deborah uses that word to describe him, it is like a plot point in the book, whether that is the correct term or not. And that becomes sort of a theme throughout the book, an unanswered open question throughout the book. So I think that's really important. My book doesn't really deal with villains. There is no villain in the book, which some people find frustrating because I think they want to attach harder villainous terms on certain characters. And really just in terms of it being a fictional choice, it only sort of occurred to me later. A friend of mine read it and said, you didn't make that guy, you didn't make him like the lacrosse playing like frat guy, which may have been like a more obvious choice. I think I used that to just sort of get at some nuance in his characterization also, because he is also an outsider, and the fallout from what happens, the fallout from this incident lands heavily on him. And I think giving him a bit of an outsider status just made that all a little more narratively rich for me. And I think the last sort of answer I would give is, there might have been some there might be a world where Isabel might have felt common ground with Zev, right? Like here's someone in this, in the scene that I read, she feels comfortable around him in a way. There are connections. There are things he understands about her that she doesn't feel that other people understand, right? He knows the kind of Jew that she is, or he understands this kind of upbringing that other people there do not understand. So she might have felt a kinship with him, but then there is something just sort of foundationally different about them because of the ways they grew up. And I just think that's something I've experienced. And I think that's something that happens to you in college, where you're meeting all kinds of different people from, across the world or just like around the corner. And you realize that everyone has grown up with very different backgrounds and different stories. And that's part of what makes college really wonderful and also makes it really, really challenging. So I wanted to get at that as well.
And I just want to add to what you said, is that I think you handled those scenes really with a great deal of subtlety and nuance. And it's very difficult to do that when you're talking about issues of consent, but it was really well done.
Thank you.
Haviva, over here.
40, yeah. Okay, 40 years. So why did I do that? Well, I don't know. I mean, Daisy, you write fiction where like some things I don't necessarily think about them so much. It's just sort of that's the story, but I think to heighten the drama, I guess, also, and this idea that I really was interested in, this idea of her sister, that her sister left home when she was younger, and I didn't say everything. There's so much I didn't say when I was talking. They wrote letters to each other and then emails, but she never really felt like she really knew her sister. And so that was important, that she had never gone back. She hadn't seen her sister in all those years. And then with the mother, that she does feel some remorse that she didn't go back to see her parents, and that and her father died while she, all those years, and she didn't go back for the funeral. And so she does feel some remorse around that, but she's very resentful of her parents. And so that there's that baggage, of all of that resentment, that neither of them got over. Her parents were resentful of her. She was resentful of her parents. And one big theme in the book, which I also didn't say, is around forgiveness. So I won't say what happens, but there's this huge resentment and trauma around their relationship. And so that really heightens the drama of it, that they hadn't seen each other in all those years. She was in touch with her, though. With her mother, she spoke to her on the phone, and her parents, but she never went back. And the other issue that happens in the book too is this whole thing with the kibbutz, which you see a little bit at the beginning, where she would have to, in order to go back, she would have to get permission and money from the kibbutz. This was a classical kibbutz. And so there's that too, like she would have to explain why her parents weren't coming to see her. She didn't want to go into all that with the kibbutz. And the kibbutz is also kind of a character in the book as well. And all of this needing to explain everything. And she has this shame and she has guilt. So she's very much somebody, when you get to know her at the beginning, she does grow. And that's part of it too. At the beginning, she is very much someone who doesn't really know what she wants and likes to be told what to do. And she does grow up in the book. She's 60 years old, 60, which is also something that it's not like in fashion right now to write with, women protagonists who are 60 years old, but that also felt really important to me because that's who she is. And I'm 54, so I'm more interested in older characters as well. So I hope that answered your question, but yeah, that's the story.
Thank you. I have lots of questions, but we're almost out of time. But I see there's a question for Daisy in the chat from Ellie. What was it like to get such amazing reviews for your debut novel?
Oh my God. Well, wow, that's a great question. It was great. Nothing bad to say about amazing reviews. Yeah, what can I say? I was very like blown away. It's my debut and I'd been working on it for a really long time. And, like we all do. So I was just happy, you're happy for it to be out in the world, but certainly for it to find an audience and to get, to get any attention at all. It's very hard to get attention for your books. As we all know, it's, there's like less book coverage generally. And also I think that, I think there are certain books that get a lot of attention because of the subject matter or because the author has like a great story or something like that. And so for my book, which I think I was just happy that people read it and enjoyed it. So thank you.
So before I have one final question, which I'll address to all three of you, but before I ask that, I just want to tell you all to mark your calendars because August 27th is our next Literary Modiin event. Sunday, August 27th, we'll be hearing from Yoni Hammer Kasoy, whose book of poetry, The Book of Noah, just came out. Michael Golding, his novel Quick Bright Things, and Daphne Calote, I hope I'm saying that right. She has a story collection called The Archivist. So mark your calendars. And then the other thing I want to announce, which is not even on the website yet, but we're going to have an in-person / hybrid event in November 5th. So those of you who are local enough in driving distance to Modiin, I hope you'll come out to Modiin for that. And that's going to be with Jennifer Lang, Janice Weitzman, and Dina Kraft. And of course, we'll also have it on Zoom for anybody who's not in driving distance. Anyway, back to my last question. And tomorrow I'm going to send out an email with the recording, but also links to the author websites and all of that. Daisy, you mentioned something about writing into the feelings, and I want to ask all three of you, how do you do that in your writing? How do you write into the feelings? What does that mean? What does that statement mean to you? And, if you want to give us a quick example from the books.
I mean, I'll just start, and because I have talked about that because people have asked me about the book being autobiographical or what pieces are autobiographical, because there are certainly overlaps. I talked about some of them today between my life and the novel. But what I basically say is that the feelings are the autobiographical piece. And then I had to create, fictional events to kind of power those feelings. So, you're making choices along the way. How can I tell a story? How can I get people to keep turning the pages? And that's kind of the container for the feelings, which I wanted to write about. One example is there's a scene in the book, a kind of climactic scene where Isabel goes to a party at her professor's house. And this was something that I kind of have experience with when I went to college. We would occasionally be invited to go to a professor's house for a party. And I just remember the feeling of being in those homes, like real adult homes where people had carpets and all these things that I didn't have. So those feelings were the same, but in the novel, I have something like very dramatic happen at that party. And that is not something I ever experienced. So that's sometimes how I talk about the difference between the fiction and the real story.
Maxim, Haviva, you want to answer?
So I don't know if I've ever said it that way, but when you asked it, I thought, okay, I'm on the spot now. I got to think of what to say. But I guess maybe my whole beginning when I was talking about like these things I wanted to deal with. So like when I'm writing memoir, so I write what happened. And this writing fiction, it's very different where, like I might have these themes I want to deal with, and then I get to create the story that's around them. So I guess it is writing into certain feelings or less ideas, I think, right? Like less ideas I want to explore, more feelings. So I like that you asked that, this feeling of, around parenting, or the feeling around also where is home is another thing that I don't know if I mentioned of, she was living in Israel at that time, and she goes back to her childhood area where she and feeling torn between the two places, or where is home, what makes home, is home really a place, or is it a feeling? And the Wizard of Oz is a theme in the book because of that. And this isn't what you asked, but I'll just also throw in this, which I'm interested to hear if if you also feel this, of when I'm writing also fiction and really also memoir, but let's say specifically fiction around symbolism. So I don't think beforehand, like all the symbols that I want to have in the book. I just write the story. And like in life, like the symbolism just comes through, and then I might heighten certain things. But like with The Wizard of Oz, I mean, there was a point when I had dialogue and someone said, this police officer, John, who if you read the book, you'll meet him. He says, oh, you're not in Kansas anymore. And then I started, like, as I'm writing, all this Wizard of Oz imagery started coming out in the whole book. And then it became this whole thread in the whole book. So yeah, I don't remember why I brought that up, but home. Yeah, this whole feeling of what's home. And so that was something also that I wanted to explore in the book.
Well,
I mean, I think I just want to interject for a second. I think that's what readers connect with, right? They connect with the emotion that we're trying to get across, which is, and so unless, the plot is, a little less important, at least in literary fiction, it's like we want people to connect, and it's through emotions and the feelings. So I like what you both said about, wrapping those into. Okay, sorry, Maxime, go ahead.
No, I actually fully agree with you. It's actually more or less what I wanted to say as well, which is that I learned from my literary ancestors. My father is a writer, and we also had an early Israeli writer, my father's aunt Batya Kahana, who was an early Israeli writer who wrote in Russian but published in Hebrew translation. And sort of I learned as a child from my father that perhaps the most important thing is not to be afraid to come across as vulnerable in your story, and whether it's fiction or memoir, in a sense, does not matter, because the generic differences are almost insignificant between what happened and what might have happened but did not quite happen this way. So for me, I genuinely believe that unless you are prepared to reveal the full extent of your emotions, your vulnerability, your wrath, whatever the sentiment may be, you should probably not go there. And whether I succeed or not, I don't know. But for instance, in this little book, Immigrant Baggage, so there is a section where basically, imagine I'm in this southern Russian town with my daughter, with my child, and I'm basically about to commit a certain literary crime, which I justify because the authorities are trying to conceal an important truth from the people having to do with an emigre writer's past, because he himself was an emigre and was opposed to Bolshevism. And basically, I describe the struggle that I have, because I have to, on the one hand, think about the excitement of wresting this out of the authorities' hands in this concealed archive, but on the other hand, the safety of my child. And when I wrote about it, I remember thinking, look, I'm probably making a mistake, but unless I depict the full spectrum of all the roiling emotions, it's not going to work.
No, that's what people say all the time, right? Let it all out. You gotta let it all out on the page.
Julie, thank you for having us. And I
This
just
is
want to say
great. I want to
you're a
thank you
saint for
all.
doing this, really.
Yeah. This is I love these events, and my pandemic project, or my pandemic passion, is to have these events. So there's still more questions. Okay, people feel free to stay on the line. I think Ellen Tuckman's asking Haviva, is the death in Massachusetts a mystery? Yes.
Yes, there is a mystery element to the book. You don't know how they died until the end. So, and that's something that Nomi's also trying. It's one of the things she's trying to figure out. I also didn't mention, I keep saying there's so much I didn't mention. There's also a diary. There's a book that either Jude or her son Jonah were reading when Nomi gets to the farmhouse, and that's where she ends up staying for the whole time. She sees a book on the table that is a diary of a woman who was in hiding with her son during the Holocaust in Poland. And she wrote the diary in hiding. And so one of them, when she gets to the house, she sees that someone had been underlining profusely the book and had been reading it very carefully. And so she reads the book and she gets to know whoever was underlining the book at the same time. Wait, what was the question?
About the death.
Okay, the death and so yes, so there's a lot of mystery in the book. There's a lot of this, her trying to figure out what happened, and then you only find out at the end. But that's just one. I'd say the book is like part mystery, part coming of age, a 60-year-old woman coming of age, part like spiritual, occult, kind of, it's a lot of different things, but mystery is one of the elements. And in general, I discovered with fiction writing that my first draft of my first novel, I gave away a lot at the beginning, and I learned now that you need to not reveal everything right at the beginning when you're writing a book, and keep things from the reader and slowly reveal them. So that is one of the things that I slowly reveal. And as Naomi, because she doesn't know. So you're with Naomi the whole time, not knowing a lot of things, and then you get to know later. There's other things as well that are surprises in the book.
And last question, actually, Maxim and Haviva, you can answer Ellen Tuckman in chat, but Tessie asked Maxim, how did your child feel about that?
My child was actually asleep in God when the culmination of this chapter of this misadventure took place, when I was almost arrested, etc. I don't mean to say it kind of lugubriously, but I think there's no way to summarize the full extent of this. But basically, the child slept through the anguish of this experience. And then when I returned to the hotel where she was sleeping, we got in the car and basically drove to the airport and left on the next flight. And that was the last time I was there.
I'll just say, by the way, I have a good friend here in Modiin who's was also a refusenik. And he also came and did college in America first, and then he came to Israel, and he's was a founder of a startup and very successful. He sold it to Samsung, and they invited him to come back to Russia on the bill of like the government was invited him, and they still arrested him when they got here when he got there. Or I don't know, they claimed he filled out something wrong on his entry form, and there was a couple of very tense days for my close friend, who's his wife, not knowing, you're going to get out. And since then, they're like, never again. We're not going back. We're not going back to Russia. So you got out, yatzat b'zol, as we say here. You were able to get home and go straight to the airport.
Yeah.
So,
and this is a paperback, by the way, just so yeah.
Yeah, mine too.
Yeah.
Paperback.
Okay, well, I'm going to wrap it up now. Thank you very much, Haviva, Daisy, Maxim, and everybody who stayed on the line. This was a great hearing from all three of you about your books. And for those of you who haven't read them yet, go out and buy their books. That's it. Have a great night and a great day wherever you are dialing in from. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.